Chapter. Welcome.
Hello. Hi, I'd like to, I think we need to get started, so if people could come on in and take their seats. Give people a second. Thanks for coming. My name is Doug Padgett. I'm one of the senior advisors in the Religious Freedom Office, and I am here to introduce very briefly one of our heroes. Protecting vulnerable communities and persons is always a priority for our office and for our State Department and for everyone here, I'm sure. But the communities that were targeted for genocide by ISIS, including Yazidis, Christians, Shia Muslims, and others, have suffered terribly. This has been a priority for Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, and USAID Administrator Mark Green, who have directed the resources of the American people through their public institutions to these communities who have suffered unspeakable crimes. It has been a huge part of our work at the State Department's International Religious Freedom Office since 2014, and actually for a decade or more before that. The suffering of these communities has been heartbreaking to witness. Our work continues. On the front lines of this work has been Pascal Warda. Pascal was born in Dahuk in northern Iraq, where ethno-religious minorities have lived together for centuries, a model of pluralism that we, our partners and civil society members, like yourselves, are working to preserve. Pascal currently serves as the president of the Hammurabi Human Rights Organization, which she founded in 2003 with her husband, William. Hammurabi Human Rights, of course, takes its name from the Code of Hammurabi, still another reminder of the rich cultural heritage of Iraq. Their work to monitor human rights and document violations has won respect from around the world. They were among the first to document the terrible atrocities of ISIS against Yazidi and Christian women and girls in northern Iraq. Pascal and Hammurabi Human Rights conducted hundreds of interviews with survivors, documented the systematic campaign to destroy the cultural heritage of indigenous communities, including the destruction of holy sites, churches, mosques, and cemeteries across northern Iraq. Pascal has also served in the Iraqi government. She was the Minister of Migration and Displacement in the Iraqi interim government and was one of only 6 women in the 32-member interim Iraqi Council of Ministers. During this IRF ministerial, the State Department is honoring Pascal and her husband William with the State Department's first ever International Religious Freedom Award in recognition of their extraordinary efforts to advance this human right. And I will add, 2 years ago, on the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UN designated Pascal as one of the 30 most distinguished defenders of human rights. We are honored to have her with us today. Please join me in welcoming Pascal Warda.
Thank you. First of all, good evening, and thank you very much for your presence and for this invitation for State Department, which is always the organization which think about what is happening really in Iraq. It's an honor for me to speak today with my excuses for my bad English, but I would like to manage the thing because we are always solicited for many things, so we can be a little bit confusing between French, English, Arabic, Aramaic, always working without stopping. So thank you very much, dear Doc, because we are now more than burdened by our mission in a country where we have to rebuild everything. And the most difficult thing is to rebuild human person, which was completely affected by this violation and violence of ISIS, which you have seen all and assisted what happens in that area, which is a millennium society, millennium civilization. We in each period had, unfortunately, many situations similar to what we saw with Daesh. So today we would like to a little bit highlight what we can do in such a difficult situation. I think like Christians, we were always called to live and to witness that we can't live a minute without a hope. So our hope is to witness that we can do something even when situations are witnessing to us very dark way of dealing of the situations. But I think as humans and as people who believes that this country is our country and we have to defend all the rights of all persons, and like Christians we never ever can say, okay, is my issue, so I defend my people and I will leave aside the other people. So Hammurabi is one of those organizations which was with every single Iraqi who was in the situation in those areas we act. So with Christians, Yazidis, Shabak who are Muslims, Shia, with Kakais, with all those minorities, even Arabs, Kurds who were in this area, we were present for saying, yes, we are here to bring you in the faith on the hope, because when we hope, we can act, we do something. When we lose hope, we can do nothing because we are in dark way. So Hammurabi Human Rights Organization, like an NGO, what is the possibility they can bring to people? Not very much things, because all the situation demand and request so much money, so much possibility of being present to the situations. But this was not a factor to stop us believing and acting as we were able to do. So with our relations with NGOs, with even some governments like US and France and many European countries, we were able to achieve many important projects which were accounted little projects, but those little projects, I can make you sure that they did the difference to help people to stay and to believe that they can make it really even in such a difficult situations. So Hammurabi was one of the first NGOs for maybe 2 months in the very first days of Daesh situation, even before. But to take an example, was inside the people, with the people, displaced people. Most of our members were in Nineveh Plain and Erbil and around, so they were displaced also with people. So the car of Hammurabi, the members of Hammurabi were calling me that we are in the displacement, but we have to help people who are in worse situation than us. When I saw that the most simple things didn't exist for those families, what we can do. So we were just contacting our brothers in Switzerland, in US, in Europe, to say, please help us help those people. So in humanitarian relief term, we were present till now, because till now we have some camps, Yazidis especially, who are still in the camps. So we distributed all kind of humanitarian, even in the the areas where there were little groups, but they had any contact with any other organizations. For example, UN deal with big gatherings, with big camps. They will not deal in the very far villages. So we were there to say, no, we have 10 families, 1,000 of families, 100 families in each different areas and cities. So we were just in a side doing what we can do with our partners, in another side making information that you have UN and others and governments to go here and there. So we believe that defending human rights is not a question of writing reports only. Yes, we monitor first mission, we monitor human rights situation, and we deliver many reports in a year. So it's important that to document those violations are ongoing and happening daily in Iraq. But this is not enough. When you say human rights and protection of human rights, is just to go to people right directly and to say what we can do for you. Okay, you would like to go back to your house? Yes, but how we can go? We have no water, clean water to drink. So this give us idea of what we can do in urgent situation. Provide the machines in each house to have a source of clean water. So we did this with the help of CSI, Christian Solidarity International, which is one of the NGOs who most famous in the crises and very difficult situations. We were helped to do this in very urgent way. Same thing, I was to government of France in the south when I spoke about this situation of welcoming people and children. We have nothing. They were there to say, we can do this and we can do that. So I think there is a solidarity which we can create, like NGOs, and NGOs are, I think, the entities which deserve more and more help and direct help to them, because they have no other aims to take this mission if it's not a faith of on those people. Hammurabi was also to make this continuous faith on human rights are like realities. Was one of the main organizations to welcome all those survivors, women, Christian and Yazidis. We had many cases which we documented, and I hope nearly I will issue a kind of book of all those cases we documented of those survivors. Each story you can learn so many things on violations, on sexual abuses, and this discrimination because of their faiths, because of their beliefs. Hammurabi is not new in this issue of defending the beliefs. We were there to in 2012 also. We were awarded by State Department because we did this work of respect for the difference in beliefs and protection of the beliefs in Iraq. As you know, Iraq is the country of faith, the country of first we can say it, revelation of God to himself, to the humans, is the country of Abraham, who is the father of the faith for everybody. So it's not a question who believes, why they believe. I was just laughing the one day in 2004 on television. Somebody said, "Oh, how you got all those churches very easily like this?" Because they were thinking that American built us churches and brought us Christianity. So somebody from Basra called on television directly was telling me, "Oh, how you got these churches very easily and very fastly like this, and you are Christian, you belong to Occidental people." I said, "Sorry, I know you are an ignorant. You can't speak other thing than your ignorance, because you are not Iraqi, or you are ignorant, or you are outside the borders, because Iraq is the cradle of the faith. Abraham was an Iraqi, Mesopotamian. I think Mesopotamia is Iraq of today also. So when Christianity was in Iraq in 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, there were not yet any Muslim. There were not yet any idea of any other monotheist, religions. So please just see the history, be Iraqi, and come to Baghdad, go to Basra, go to people where you see millennium churches. I was visiting the first church apostles began after the mission in Iraq, in Mesopotamia. It's called Kuche in South Baghdad, maybe 35 kilometers in South Baghdad, and it was touching. I have so movement. You are touched because you feel this is your heritage, the first church from where the mission began to Iraq. It was something very, very important for me. So when we see that this church is completely done, had become as a ground, but you see the rest and the ruins. You still say, the Arab there, they say, "Please just rebuild this church, it's our church." I said, "Yes, it's your church." They were all Muslims and guardians of this land of church. They are Muslims. "Yes, I hope we will rebuild it one day." "It's your church." Yes. So Iraq is this country of so many richnesses we don't even imagine. So Hammurabi, in this faith of being part of this history, we just had many initiatives. We are working not only on humanitarian, but we are ongoing in returnees solutions for returnees from displacement areas to original areas of Christian Yazidis and Shabak. We were in the villages. We continue to be in each project in the villages with people, distributing possibility of life, teaching. Even we had already we have 3 possibilities of rehabilitation of those people affected by Daesh from Mosul, Yazidis from Sinjar and from areas. We have a center of psychological rehabilitation in Karakosh, in Nineveh Plain, and we have a center in Duhok to rehabilitate those Yazidi children who were affected by Daesh, and we do also the legal help for those. We have a center for legal help for legal helps for those people who lost their rights. They don't know what to do, where to go. Their papers were completely lost. So we tried to help all those people with very simple possibility we have. So, but we believe that if we act in this sense of our faith in the human being, in the human dignity, we can get things are requested, maybe not completely or not perfect way, but we do believe that we can arrive to perfection when we do what we can. So to re-give the trust on people, Iraqi people, especially in minority areas, who are victims of bad politics, of bad policies. There is no real plans, there is no real strategies in government side to protect those areas and to say those areas have a specificity. This specificity have to be protected by governmental tools and possibilities. Till now, no way, because contrary, they call these areas disputed areas, while no person who are in the area, original of the area, dispute with each with other. They just live since hundreds and thousands of years together like brothers, regardless of difference, even if problems arrive and even massacres arrive from time to time. But they always decided to remade and to come back to their ancestral land. But now you see the bad strategies of political parties, which is very strange to these communities. They made of those areas disputed areas where the stability is difficult to be brought. So we ask how we can bring really stability to those people who came back. Like NGOs, what we can do? We have no power. We have no enough money. So we go to USA, to others. We were waiting that government accomplish all the duty of lightening cities, of doing things. No, just government brought the electricity beginning and water, clean water a little bit to live use, and that was all. And a little bit the streets. That was all. But the need was not there. It was possible to tell those returnees, don't fear. You know, how they don't fear. It's not with the words. We have to lighten the ways, the city. So we were obliged to say, please, USAID, do you have a possibility to help us in this? They were there to say yes. Thanks very much to USAID and to Heartline, which was the NGO which had the possibility of USAID possibility, and they gave us, and we achieved very nice and very complete project of lightening the streets, of putting the road signs, because this is the signs of stability of people. Then schools and hospitals. I was to hospital, unfortunately, for my father who passed away 1 month ago. It's horrible to see those needs in the hospitals. We still have a very bad way of carrying the health care in Iraq. The health, even if you see government have for free health care, you can go and do anything you want in the hospitals for free. But what kind of quality of care? What kind of nothing is nothing. I was just furious and saying, even in the Hague, since 1991, we are called to be different than anywhere else, because we have to have real hospitals, real services, no nurses, no real care of people. So very easily people die like that. Is impossible to be accepted forever. So because we are in the situation, we still somehow in the situation of war, we are obliged to say this and to ask our partners to help us, to help people going out of the situation of crisis. We are in real crisis, and we still in that situation if we don't speak higher. So minorities in all this are more, because in their areas it's difficult to bring things from very short time to be existent. In Bartella, I am not sure that there is a real hospital. We have centers of health. We have a big hospital in Karakosh, which is closed. Everybody use this, but we need many machines, many things, which I detected their situation was really a situation of human rights there. So we would like to do some recommendations which bring us to be more responsible in exchange and in destination of those donations. I think government of a country of huge oil, we are. We are a rich country, a huge rich country, but we are bad administrated. So we didn't wait everything be magically. We need a real school of right administration, of good administration of our goods. So this is a long-term work. So why we would like to, in the same time that we are teaching and we are rebuilding this person, this human being, to see the country like their properties, their thing, for what they have to live and to think that they do better. It's long-term work. So why we call you to help us, and why we call you to reach NGOs, which are, and government themselves. They said NGOs did a remarkable work more than government. So this is a very encouraging thing for us, but we do have no help of government like NGOs. So we ask your help to help our people, to help our government to go out of the crisis. Thank you very much. Sorry, I was asked to speak a little bit about women. I will say just a flash about women, if it's possible, because it's very important, very important. Iraqi women, which is very, very strong women. Today she still come back, and she's still in big dilemma. Till now, we imposed a quota of not less than 25% of all administration and others must be women. But we were just limited to parliament and then to city councils. But we are trying to do better. But you know, we do more than 25%. We do till 30% and sometimes more. But each time and every time, if we leave to only our men, they don't like that we continue. They don't like all this part to be to women. And till now, you have seen in 2004, we were 6 ministers in the government, and all big ministries, and ministries which were rebuilt from zero. I was one of those who rebuilt a ministry from zero money. We didn't have any economy, any budget. So we rebuilt it, we did, and we challenged those difficulties. Today, no one of women is minister. So it's really a shaming for Iraq. And I am saying this to my government from here, and I say it in Baghdad. We are ashamed of having no women in the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pascal. That was great. Thank you very much. We're going to move right into our plenary panel, and then that'll be followed immediately by our last speaker of the day. And I just need to find my stuff. I'm here. This panel that we're going into now is an opportunity for us to explore the relationship between the protection of religious freedom. Can you guys hear me? Is that good? Better? The protection of religious freedom and some critical social goods, things that make our lives better, that make our countries better, that make our societies better. And with me today are 2 researchers who have dedicated their attention to the relationship between, on the one hand, religious freedom and stable, secure societies, and on the other hand, the relationship between religious freedom and economic prosperity. And although actually they've probably both done a little of each, and Brian has actually done quite a bit of both. So I want to introduce both of our panelists, and then I'm going to let them speak for a while, and then we'll open up the floor to some questions if we have time. Nilay Saiya, to my left, is Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Global Affairs at Nanyang Technological University. He holds research interests in religion and global politics, international security and foreign policy. His major work has been published in journals such as Conflict Management and Peace Science, Terrorism and Political Violence, Social Science, Computer Review, Political Research Quarterly, Middle East Policy, and many others. In 2018, he published a book, Weapon of Peace, How Religious Liberty Combats Terrorism, from Cambridge University Press. Prior to joining NTU, he served as Director of International Studies and an Assistant Professor of Political Science at the State University of New York, and he earned his PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Brian Grimm, PhD, is president, further down the line, is president of the Religious Freedom and Business Foundation and a leading expert on international religious demography and the socioeconomic impact of restrictions on religious freedom. He is also the global chairman of the biannual Business and Interfaith Peace Awards and Symposium. Brian recently served as chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the role of faith and was a speaker at the forum's 2018 annual meeting in Davos, as well as being a TEDx speaker. Brian also supports and works closely with the Business for Peace platform of the United Nations Global Compact. Prior to becoming the foundation's founding president in 2014, Brian directed the largest social science effort to collect and analyze global data on religion at the Pew Research Center, and this is how I first became acquainted with his work. He also worked for 2 decades as an educator in the former Soviet Union, China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. And he holds a doctorate in sociology from Penn State. So I'm going to stop there and allow you all to present your comments. Thanks, Nilay.
Do you want us to stay here?
You can go to the podium if you like. Actually, that's fine, yeah.
Okay.
It might actually be easier.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay. Thank you, Doug. I'd also like to thank Secretary of State Pompeo for hosting this important event, Ambassador Brownback, and all the employees of the State Department who have worked so hard to put this ministerial together. Thank you. I would like to talk about the relationship between religious freedom and national security. I think we're all aware of the fact that the world currently faces a crisis in global religious freedom. We just heard a story from a survivor of religious persecution, and the fact that these kinds of stories are becoming more and not less common in the world testifies to a world where religious repression and persecution is increasing. But just to go over some of the numbers, according to the latest data from the Pew Research Center, about 1/3 of countries in the world have high or very high government restrictions on religion. These are restrictions on the practice of faith that are enforced through the laws and policies of states. About 1/3 of countries in the world also have high or very high social regulation of religion or social hostilities involving religion. Whereas government restrictions on religion pertain to the laws and policies of states, social hostilities involving religion or social regulation of religion involves restrictions on the practice of faith that are carried out by private individuals in society. So they're called social hostilities instead of government restrictions. About 42% of countries in the world have high or very high overall religious regulation, either the result of government restrictions on religion, social hostilities involving religion, and it's often the case that these two coexist at the same time. And about 83% of the world's population lives in countries that have high or very high regulations on religion, where the practice of faith is either severely limited or curtailed altogether. So this raises an important question. Why does it matter? Why does it matter that so many people in the world have their most fundamental religious rights restricted? Well, I think it matters for 2 reasons. The first and most important reason is that it's a matter of justice. Religious freedom is a fundamental moral and human right that protects the dignity of individuals to seek transcendent truth, to live in accordance with their faith-based convictions, to bear witness to their religiously informed worldviews, to carry out rituals and practices central to their faith, to worship together with those of like mind, to change their faith, to renounce their faith, or to have no faith at all. That 83% of the world's population lives in countries where large portions of the population are not able to exercise these basic rights, should prick the conscience of anyone who claims to care about dignity, human rights, and justice. But unfortunately, religious freedom is the one human right that often gets swept under the rug. And this is even the case among those in the human rights community. And this is what leads one scholar to proclaim that religious freedom is the orphan of human rights. But in addition to that, there's also another reason to support religious liberty. And that is that research by political scientists and sociologists has shown that religious freedom is powerfully and positively correlated with a number of political and social and economic goods. Things like economic development, social stability, social harmony, and the security of states. In my own work, I have looked at the relationship between repression of religion and different forms of violent conflict. These include interstate disputes, civil wars, and terrorism. In my book, Weapon of Peace, How Religious Liberty Combats Terrorism, I examined every instance of faith-based terrorism in the world that occurred since 1990. And I'd like to take the time to share a few of the findings with you today. Number one, religiously free countries were also free from religious terrorism 99% of the time. What this means is if you were to add up all of the years in which countries could be objectively classified as being religiously free, religious terrorism would have occurred in about 1% of those country years. The second finding, by contrast, is that in highly repressive countries that are also highly populated, religious terrorism occurred with a 95% likelihood. The third finding is that religiously unfree countries witnessed more than 14 times as many religious terrorist attacks as their religiously free counterparts. Number four, 9 of the 10 countries hit hardest by domestic religious terrorism imposed serious restrictions on the practice of faith. The fifth and the sixth findings pertain to specific forms of religious regulation. The fifth finding is that countries in the Islamic world that enforce blasphemy laws and blasphemy codes experience almost 6 times as many terrorist attacks as countries in the Islamic world where these laws do not exist. The sixth finding is that countries that either restrict or ban the wearing of the Islamic veil, sometimes known as the burqa bans, these countries experience almost 15 times as many terrorist attacks as countries that do not ban or restrict the burqa or the full-faced Islamic veil. Now, religious repression also has a transnational component. The seventh finding is that international religious terrorist organizations originate from highly repressive settings. 88% of all religious international terrorist organizations came from highly repressive countries, 8% from moderately restrictive countries, and only 3% from religiously free settings. Now, just as the terrorist organizations originate from religiously repressive settings, they also target repressive countries. 70% of the targets of international religious terrorism were highly repressive states. About 20% were moderately restrictive states, and less than 10% were religiously free countries. So this leads to one final question, and that question is, why does this relationship exist between religious freedom and peace on one hand and religious repression and violence on the other? Well, I think there's a number of reasons why, probably a dozen or more, but I'll take the time just to briefly mention 4 of them. The first way that religious freedom leads to peace is through pluralism. In religiously free settings, extremists will have their claims challenged and critiqued in the marketplace of ideas, and they will have to defend them. Scholars of Islam, for example, have found that individuals less knowledgeable about the faith were more prone to the appeal of extremism and terrorism insofar as they lacked the spiritual foundation necessary to be able to combat those extremist narratives. The second way in which religious freedom leads to peace is through politics. The political advantages that come with religious freedom allow would-be militants to work through alternative and legitimate channels, such as grassroots activism, civic engagement, and of course electoral politics, by which they can seek to shape religion, state, and society. But where these avenues are not available and where communities of faith are not able to bring their religiously informed ideas into the public square, they're much more likely to see violence as the only way to change the status quo. The third way that religious freedom leads to peace is through peace building and reconciliation. Religious freedom empowers communities of faith to do good in the world in accordance with their religious beliefs. And the good that these communities do leads to more stable societies, and they also lower the grievances among the general population, making the turn to the gun less likely. We might say that religious freedom unlocks the spiritual capital of faith-based communities. The final way that religious freedom leads to peace is through policing and counterterrorism. History teaches, and many studies confirm, that religiously repressive counterterrorism policies work at cross purposes with the goal of effectively combating terrorism. The goal of combating terrorism should be to drive a wedge between terrorists and their potential constituencies. What religiously repressive counterterrorism policies do is they drive terrorists and their constituencies closer together. So in these contexts, religious terrorists have an easier time attracting recruits and making the credible claim that their faith is under attack and it needs to be defended. So in conclusion, in my view, the evidence is clear. How a state treats religion is a matter not only of dignity, justice, and human rights, but also security, stability, and the overall well-being of states. And for this reason, it is time for governments around the world to take religious freedom seriously, if not for moral considerations, then at least for the sake of peace and stability. Thank you.
Well, he just made my case for me. The business case for religious freedom is that in places where there's religious freedom, you have economies that are run for the good of people instead of bullet and bomb makers. You didn't make that last conclusion, but I thought I'd do that. Well, okay, now look, first I want to recognize there's 3 men up here. We did have an event earlier this week that was women filmmakers, Sharon Tabor, Deborah Paul, sorry, and Christy Onassis were part of that event, and maybe some others here. So we're balancing out, so a men and a women's event maybe a little bit. Well, notice how we're dressed. Are we dressed for business or not? Yes? No. A couple weeks ago, I was at the global headquarters for Salesforce, which is one of the largest, most innovative, growing tech companies out in San Francisco. They've built the largest, tallest building west of the Mississippi, is the Salesforce headquarters in San Francisco. I was there during Pride Week, and there were rainbow flags everywhere. The lobby of Salesforce was decked out with a drag queen display. And I go into there, and why do you think I was there? Well, they invited me to come and speak about the business case for religious freedom. And I went in, and of course I was the odd man out. First I had a tie on. There was 20,000 employees, no one had a tie on. 20,000 employees, and I was the minority white guy. I was a guy, there were lots of women. 20,000 employees in t-shirts, and all kinds of colors and nationalities and languages. And, I was sort of the odd guy out. And they have, in Salesforce, they have employee groups called employee affinity groups. They have another name for it, but many companies have these groups where groups of people can gather around their identity to support each other and help promote the company in different ways and support the company. And of course, they have a Salesforce Pride group for LGBT people. Well, it was the fastest growing employee group in Salesforce's history invited me to come and speak about the value of religious freedom, and it was the Faith Force at Salesforce. So right in this company, right in the middle of one of the most liberal cities in the United States, therefore one high up there in the world, you have a company filled with people. Not ties, not suits, not briefcases, filled with people, a lot of young people, and they're all there excited about what they're doing. And you go in their lobby, and besides the drag queen display on the other side, it looks like a national forest, and everybody's trailblazers, and everything has a sort of trailblazing theme. And they invited me in to come and speak, and the woman who invited me is the head of Faith Force at Salesforce. And what a interesting story of how that all got started within this company that supports all kinds of liberal values. They oppose the Religious Freedom Restoration Act in Indiana that then Governor Pence, but now Vice President Pence was supporting because they felt it didn't guard LGBT rights enough. Well, in this company that is supposedly came out against religious freedom, after the drag queen display, the next display going up is their Faith Force display. Now, how do they balance these things? Something that, a cultural war issue, and somehow they don't see a conflict. In fact, when their Faith Force was launched, they had an LGBT people, a Catholic, a Muslim, and a Jewish person, and they're all LGBT, get up and talk about why faith is so important. So I think one of the advantages of religious freedom is it sets people free to do good. If we give each other the space to be who we are with all of our rainbow of identities, then in that space where we're working for a common goal, and everybody's goal at Salesforce was to, get that next customer, and make the products better, do their job better, and how can we work together? So I think that it's not just that religious freedom is good for business. The flip side's true. Business is good for religious freedom. I'm going to jump around a little bit. Now, our previous speaker has done a lot in Iraq. When I was at the Pew Research Center, we did a survey in Iraq the year before ISIS took over, and in northern Iraq. And we asked, one of the questions was, what is your chief concern for your country today? Is it religious terrorism? Is it sectarian conflict? Is it, this, that, or the other things? What was the number one concern? Jobs. Northern Iraq, well-educated population, a lot of resources, great business opportunity, and frankly, none of us were there to say, come on, let's get some business investment. So if I can say that one of our jobs, for many of those of us here, we try to help people be religiously literate to understand the value and importance of religious freedom. We need to be business literate. That means talking a language that business understands, not expecting them to understand our languages. So when I go to Salesforce and I talk about religious freedom, I talk about it in terms of diversity and inclusion, religious diversity and inclusion. That makes sense. Oh yeah, that's really important, and they get it. So part of the task that we have as religious freedom people and government and civil society people is learn how to talk to our people the 20,000 people in Salesforce Tower. And you go to the top of the tower, if it's not, it was a foggy day, of course it is every day in San Francisco, but they have free hors d'oeuvres and you can sit up there and they have beautiful garden area and the business are doing these things and they're bringing people together around conference tables to do things and achieve. And so I think they have a lot to teach us. Well, I have a couple data points I want to mention. The Pew study, I just came from a press conference with Tom Farr, who was there. If you don't know Tom Farr, he was the first director of the director of the first International Religious Freedom Office that had a chair, and I think that was it. And then the ambassador came, and then you got a desk, and then sort of vacuum cleaner. That's what it was. And so the latest Pew study came out on Monday evening. I got an advance copy, and it's not, now the number of people living in countries with high restrictions is 85% of the world's population. By my analysis, they didn't use that number, but it's the right number. And and that means there's been a 2 billion person increase in the number of people living in countries with high restrictions or hostilities over the past 10 years. So the world's population has increased by 1 billion. So the population of people living under religious restrictions is double population growth. Now, part of that new report of Pew that I suggest that you have a look at is they looked at the 10 years of the study, which Doug mentioned that I had started, and now one of my interns from back years ago is now the director of the project. So it's like, and it's, that's cool to see the generation of it going on. I looked at the countries where restrictions were going up, the countries where the restrictions were sort of not staying the same, but going up a little bit, not a lot, and then the countries where restrictions were going down, or if not staying the same, but going down. The GDP growth rate of the countries where restrictions were going down is double the GDP growth rate of countries where restrictions were going up. That backs up a study I had done several years ago in 2014 that saw religious freedom as one of 3 among 27 variables we considered, 3 factors that predicted GDP growth. And there this study has just confirmed that earlier study. So the data are clear. I'm going to conclude with, sorry, lost my notes. With one other data point, and I'll mention China in the end, and maybe if there's questions, I can deal with China in a question. Bloomberg, about a month ago, published a chart showing the top 5 countries where millionaires are migrating from or fleeing, and the top 5 countries where millionaires are coming to. Number 1, Australia. Number 2, the United States. On the bottom of the list, number 1, where they're fleeing, China. 15,000 millionaires leaving a year. Number 2, Russia. So when you look at that chart, we don't have a PowerPoint here, but if you look at that chart and those bars of where millionaires are going to, the level of government restrictions on religion is small. You look at these countries where millionaires are fleeing, and their government restrictions are large. So the same kind of data that we just heard about in security is matched by these data from the economy. And when millionaires vote with their feet, it's not just a person leaving a country, it's millions and millions of dollars leaving the country. And they didn't become millionaires usually by inheriting it from daddy, but they made that money, and they're looking to where can I go to make more money? And they're going to countries where there is more religious freedom. Now, China scored the worst on that list. Now, China is my kids were born in China. Actually, 2 of my kids were born in Xinjiang and Urumqi. So all my kids have Uyghur names. I have a Uyghur name, it's Habibullah. And so I lived there for many years. And so I know the Uyghur situation very well. And in the years leading up to Xi Jinping, the current president, especially after the Cultural Revolution, when the Cultural Revolution ended in the 1970s, religion was completely forbidden. No churches were open, no mosques were open, no temples were open, nothing, no Buddhist temples, nothing. When the Cultural Revolution ended, they started to open. And for years, China let that bloom. And so all these people that had repressed religion went from 0 religion to today, half of Chinese people have some religion. It's the largest Buddhist country in the world. It's the seventh largest Christian country in the world by population. It's the largest Taoist population in the world. They have more folk religionists in the country than any other country of the world. In fact, China has more religious believers of all faiths than any other country except India, because everybody in India is more or less. But when you have half of China having some faith and belief, that's a lot of people. Well, that sort of lifting of those restrictions after the Cultural Revolution coinciding with China's tremendous economic boom. Over the last 10 years, restrictions on religion have been growing to the point that we've already heard about in numerous testimonies during these days. And their growth rate, economic growth rate, is shrinking. Economists have a lot of explanations for that. But when you're disenfranchising huge segments of your population, that depresses a lot of things, including things economists monitor, consumer confidence, workplace morale, and investor confidence. So there's a reason that China's economy is slowing, and religious freedom is a big part of that story. So I'll end there, but hopefully start thinking about business in a different way, and realizing that business is filled with people, and they want to live out the aspirations that we're all seeking for, and they can be a great ally for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Nilay and Brian. We have just a few minutes, probably time for maybe 1 to 3 questions. If people want to go to the microphones, we'll take a couple at once, and then we'll see where we are. If you, sir, want to go ahead.
All right. My name is Jeff Chen. I'm with the Falun Gong Association of Washington, D.C. I have one comment and one question. My comment is, we talked about the economy and security. Actually, oftentimes we think the victims of those being persecuted are the only victims. But actually, the religious repression in China has a lot more victims, both inside China and outside China. In order to put those people in jail, it takes a lot of people to do that. And so the legal system has to be corrupted, and people's morality has to be corrupted in order for those people to carry out the persecution policy. So, and in order to sustain the 20-year persecution of Falun Gong, those people have to be in a key leadership position. Now, in an environment where people can be ransacked for their belief, those people will not care about the fair trade with another country, and they will not care about intellectual property theft. And certainly they do not care whether fake goods are circulated in the markets. So all these cause the damage to both people inside China and people outside China. So my question is, how, while engaging with China to do the business, how can we let the business people in China and outside China know the consequence of the religious persecution? That's my question.
Thanks. Next.
Good evening. I'm Tehmina Arora from India, and I'm a lawyer. I work with a group called ADF International. I have a question for Nilay. You mentioned that as religious communities have greater access to political aspirations, you see an increase in religious freedom. I think we see the opposite in India, where Hindu nationalist groups have had tremendous amount of success in their political aspirations over this last decade. And we find only an increase in violence against religious minorities, Muslims and Christians in particular. This year alone, we have recorded every single day violent attacks against Christians. And this is something that has come in the wake of great success by Hindu nationalist groups. So I wonder if you have a comment on that. Thanks.
Brian, why don't you go first? Yeah.
Yeah.
The
So
first question.
regarding China, the question of how to get businesses interested in this. So one thing is to focus on, as I made the point, businesses are filled with people. And in China, if you want to rise up in leadership, including in business, you have to be a Communist Party member. Party members are required not to have religion or practice it. So all multinational companies have a strong emphasis on diversity and inclusion. And so to talk to companies about how diverse and inclusive is your workplace in China, and are you paying attention to that, would be something that the employees of these multinational companies would get behind. So it's a different way to look at it. I know that on our first day, Congressman Frank Wolf and Speaker Pelosi talked about using penalties also to penalize companies that are selling artificial intelligence type products to China. So there's a stick and carrot approach. I think still there's for many people in China, there's concern that this economy keeps going. And I think we can make good arguments for why having an open, tolerant, and unrepressive society is going to help them in long-term economic growth. So I think those are three different tools that State Department folks are here. I hope they, and I think they are. They're looking at how can we bring to bear different kinds of arguments that can touch different people within the country.
Yes, thank you, Tamina, for that question. I think what your question gets at is the idea that religious freedom is not the same thing as democracy, right? Because there are a lot of democracies in the world that are not religiously free. So they're not necessarily the same thing. India is a democracy, and it has the institutions and habits of democracy. It has free, fair, frequent elections. They're competitive. So in all those senses, India is a democracy. But it's also a democracy where the most serious kind of religious repression is present. I was amazed reading the latest report by the Pew Research Center, and it shows that of all the countries in the world, India has the highest rates of social hostilities. And that includes countries that are currently in the midst of war, right? So there's something very terrible going on in India right now. India also has very high rates of government restriction on religion as well. I'm currently working on a project that looks at the connection between anti-conversion laws in the states of India and violent persecution against Christians. And what my preliminary results show is that in the 5 or 6 states that have and enforce these anti-conversion laws, the number of Christians who experience violent persecution is about 5 times the number of cases in other states. So again, I think it's just a case of democracy and religious liberty parting company. And it just goes to show the importance of religious freedom.
If I may, just briefly on that, because we think about this question a lot, not specific to India, but I think that one of the things you have to think about when you see those kinds of social hostilities is the role of government, not simply in promoting freedom, but in all of the mechanisms of justice and accountability. The issue of impunity is critically important. So, and also the issue of government favoritism of a particular religion. So religious freedom isn't simply saying everybody can go to a house of worship. It is actually a much broader, at least we view it in a much broader context that involves all of the institutions of democracy and how they work together, and also involves the relationship among, as the UDHR calls it, the interrelatedness and indivisibility of the regime of human rights, of fundamental freedoms, expression, assembly, association, and justice in particular. That's just my take.
Could I just say something about government favoritism of religion? That's a very, very important point. And it's kind of counterintuitive that you would think, why would religious communities that enjoy the benefits of the state turn to violence? But that's what we see happening. We often think of terrorism as a weapon of the weak. When in reality, what I'm seeing is that terrorism is a weapon of the strong. It's more often than not religious majorities who are using violence against religious minorities than the other way around. And I think there are a number of reasons why this is the case. The first is something called outbidding. So in these kinds of states where you see government favoritism of religion, religious majorities might arrive at the logical conclusion that the government doesn't go far enough in its support of those religious majorities, and so they turn to violence. Another mechanism is what we might call the creation of a culture of impunity, right? So there may not be effective law enforcement mechanisms, and religious vigilantes might come to the conclusion that the state doesn't care what they do, so they're just going to attack whoever they want to. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but yeah, state favoritism of religion is actually a major determinant of religiously based violence.
Really fast. I think because Congressman Smith is actually here, so we could do one quick question.
Okay.
Sir, thank you.
One quick question. I had two actually, but I'll see if I can do it. Interrelatedness, interconnectedness of rights. Maybe both of you could say something about your research. You've researched FORB and its relationship to economic development and violence. Could you say something about the link between some other rights? And then if there's time, how do we get from here to there? How do we get from FORB countries that have low FORB and hostility and low economic development to these other sides? If you can say something quickly about that.
Great questions. Thank you. So the interrelatedness of, or the relationship between FORB and other fundamental freedoms, and then how do we actually advance this to?
I'll say two things. One is on women's empowerment. So countries where there's religious freedom score much better on all indices of women's empowerment. And just look at Sweden. The head of the state church in Sweden's a woman, and they have a high degree of religious freedom. So those two go hand in hand. The second is poverty reduction. So where you have religious freedom, that sets free people of faith to go out and do what they often are concerned about, loving their neighbor. And that usually is translated into tangible things. So, throughout the world, there's literally thousands of different faith-based programs to help people find a job, get a better job, get the education they need to get a job. And that's all coming out of faith groups. So just an instrumental connection between the right to, sort of basic necessities of life and religious freedom can be seen there.
It's often the case that religious freedom comes as part of a bundled commodity with other human rights like women's rights and economic rights, political rights. But I would argue that religious freedom is foundational in a sense that these other rights are not, and these other rights actually spring from religious freedom. The reason I say that is because we just have to think about what religious freedom is. It is the ability to seek harmony with the widest reaches of transcendent reality, to ask the most basic fundamental questions of human life. Is there a God? Is there an afterlife? What is the way to ultimate flourishing? It's the ability to control your own thoughts. So if individuals and communities of faith are not free to control their own thoughts, they really can't be free in any other sense of the word. So if religious freedom is restricted, then we would expect other rights in society to be restricted as well.
Thank you both. Really very, very good comments, and thanks for answering our questions. We're going to turn now to our next speaker, Congressman Smith, and we're going to get him in here very quickly. Thank you. Thanks a lot. That was great. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Soon enough. Yeah. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Ryan Caldwell. I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of Legislative Affairs, and I'm thrilled to introduce one of our great advocates and friends from the United States Congress. And today it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Congressman Chris Smith from New Jersey, as a leading member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Congressman Smith has been a champion in Congress and around the world for human rights for nearly 40 years, from protecting victims of human trafficking to advancing the fight against AIDS in Africa through PEPFAR and promoting freedom of religion. Congressman Smith has repeatedly been the voice for the most vulnerable people around the world. And in fact, it was just in January that the congressman joined President Trump in the Oval Office as the congressman's landmark Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 was once again reauthorized. But not only that, and more relevant to today's conversation, Congressman Smith also led the successful effort in Congress to provide relief for religious minorities persecuted by ISIS. And he did that by authoring the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act, which was signed into law by the president at the end of last year. In short, there are few people in Congress or around the world who more embody the purpose of this ministerial in a tangible way than Congressman Smith. And so on behalf of Secretary Pompeo, I'd ask you to join me in offering a warm welcome to Congressman Chris Smith.
Brian, thank you. Thank you so very much for that very kind introduction. And I'll be brief. I've learned the importance of being brief. I don't know if some of you may know, particularly local people, about Lyme disease. Well, I chair the Lyme Disease Caucus. And I just got an amendment passed on the floor on Lyme disease, but I was asked to give a keynote at a Lyme Disease Association big meeting, about 1,000 people. And I said, how long do you want me to speak? They said, well, you got an hour. So I took a full hour and 5 minutes. And at the end of it, there were a lot of children there with their families. A little girl came up and said, Mister, your speech was long and boring. I turned around and walked away. A few minutes later, her dad came up and he said, you know, I don't know what you two were talking about, but my little daughter, she's 4, she just repeats whatever she hears. And as Tom Farr knows, I have been keeping everything within 5 to 10 minutes ever since. Again, it's great to be here at this extraordinarily important ministerial. Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Brownback, Elon Carr, all are doing amazing things, not just this week, but year-round, to better protect people of all faiths, to more freely exercise their fundamental human rights, to believe in God, the transcendent, and the eternal. They and their colleagues at state are vigorously using the tools embedded in laws like the Frank R. Wolf International Religious Freedom Act. And of course, Frank is the tremendous champion of religious freedom. Got the original legislation passed in 1998 that Tom Farr and others have so ably led throughout these many years. Well, the tools that are in that bill, or that law, are now being very faithfully implemented by the administration. Timely and faithful designation of country of particular concern, to look critically at countries and make decisions as to whether or not they are a problem and whether or not government officials are violating and part of an oppression against people of faith. The meting out of sanctions on CPC-designated countries, holding not just countries but organizations like ISIS and Boko Haram to account, and also individuals who are part of the persecution. Enhanced religious freedom training for the U.S. Foreign Service, including ambassadors and DCMs, so that this isn't some subset of issue. This is a mainstream issue in all they think, say, and do while they are deployed. And integrating religious freedom into every aspect of U.S. foreign policy, all part of that law, and now being very faithfully implemented. The world of faith, as you all know, and I believe that's why you're here, is under siege. We are at a tipping point. Threats are multiplying by the day, making this ministerial, and especially the comprehensive follow-up, especially necessary and urgent. About 4 decades ago, I read a book that had a profound impact on me and on my life. The book was Tortured for Christ by Pastor Richard Wurmbrand, and more than any other book, this book introduced me to the horrors faced by Christians living under communism. Pastor Wurmbrand's account of the 14 years he spent in Ceausescu's prisons in Romania, the torture, solidarity, the confinement, the mental cruelty, what they did to their families, the starvation, were both gripping, yet paradoxically, it was also hopeful and hope-filled. His story detailed horrible suffering, but it was also the story of incredible endurance, courage, and an indomitable spirit not to give up. That book and several trips to communist countries, including the Soviet Union and China, made me better understand Alexander Solzhenitsyn's observation that communism doesn't merely deny God's existence, communism hates him. Solzhenitsyn called it militant atheism, and that God hatred continues to thrive to this day with dictatorships like North Korea, Vietnam, and China. I had dedicated my life in the Congress to human rights issues. I've been in there for 39 years. Our world is filled with people in need. We all know it. You're all part of that solution as well. From unborn children to victims of human trafficking, people suffering from addiction and abuse, persons with disabilities, including autism, disabled veterans, and those facing famine and disease. In some areas, there has been some progress. New treatments are developed, laws are passed, and we are making some progress on other human rights issues. But in many countries of the world, there's been little progress in ending religious persecution, despite Herculean efforts by this administration to do so. In fact, in some places like China, it is actually getting worse. The terrible, largely unacknowledged reality is this: we are witnessing in the 21st century an international mega crisis in religious freedom. Religious persecution is festering and exploding around the world, and tens of millions of victims, and some of whom were here today, the lucky ones who were in freedom, and yesterday and the day before, who have told their stories, again, inspiring stories, but also stories that really cause us to act even more effectively. More than ever before, strong international leadership and diplomacy on a sustainable basis are needed to address these violations around the world. We cannot stand by idly when Rohingya Muslims are brutally cleansed from Burma. We cannot allow Nigerian Christians to face horrifying violence without acting decisively. We cannot allow the genocide faced by Iraqi Christians and Yazidis at the hands of ISIS to the legacy of that to ever reemerge, and those who have committed these horrific crimes need to be held accountable. We've got all these courts. The ICC, we probably should have a hybrid court. I pushed for that for years, but failed to hold them to account. But they need to be held to account. Otherwise, impunity and the seeds of doing it again and again drift from generation to generation. We cannot allow over 1 million Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims to be interned and tortured and killed without speaking out effectively. We cannot allow the anti-Semitism spreading like a cancer around the world to continue to fester. Natan Sharansky, the heroic Soviet Jewish former prisoner of conscience, who spent years in Perm Camp 35, and as a matter of fact, Frank Wolf and I, former congressman, we traveled to Perm Camp in the 1980s. He had just been released, but saw the terrible, terrible conditions that he had survived and overcome in. Well, he told a hearing that I chaired about the new anti-Semitism that includes a virulent hatred of Israel and the Jews who live there. And he said, here's one way you can identify it. He called it the 3 Ds. We have the traditional anti-Semitism, hate simply because a man or a woman or a child happens to be Jewish, or these 3 Ds when it comes to the nation of Israel. The first D being a denial of Israel's right to exist, a demonization of Israel, and the double standard of treatment by countries, but especially by the United Nations, who single out Israel and don't bring up the other countries where there are real violations of human rights. You know, Israel has due process, an independent judiciary, it's a democracy. Like the United States, of course they're going to make mistakes from time to time. But there are apparatuses in place, there are ways of trying to fix it. People can bring court cases. Try doing that in the People's Republic of China, or in Cuba, or in North Korea. Good luck, you'll end up in jail. Ilan Carr, the Trump administration's special envoy on monitoring and combating anti-Semitism, he briefed us yesterday on his work, and he made some points that I've been working on anti-Semitism since my first trip to the Soviet Union in 1982 as part of the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. And you had some of the people who are part of that movement earlier in the program, and I thank you for that. They're just wonderful people. Well, he told us that what's happening in the UK, in the colleges and universities, is frightening. Anti-Semitism is growing like a cancer, and it's also happening in U.S. universities and colleges as well. That needs to be checked, that needs to be combated, and I think he made a very effective plea yesterday that we need to be using things like Title VI and implement that federal civil rights law to ensure that there is not a hostile place in our college campuses for our Jewish friends, young boys and young girls. Several years ago, I visited Archbishop Ignatius Kagame in the city of Jos, Nigeria. Now, when I was there, I also met with the top Muslim leadership. I'll never forget how they told me that they're not Boko Haram. They believe in working side by side with the Christians. They made it very clear that they had a tremendous amount of support and affection for Archbishop Kagame. And so when I met with him, I heard the same thing. It was a mutual admiration society. And we know that Boko Haram, while it primarily kills Christians, it also kills pious Muslims who do not comport with their horrible agenda. Well, while I was there at an IDP camp, met this incredible Christian named Habila Adamu. He told the story about how 4 Boko Haram terrorists burst into his house, his wife screaming at the top of his lungs to leave them alone. They put an AK-47 next to his face and said, "You renounce your faith, become a Muslim right here, or we'll blow your brains out." He says, I will die first. They asked him again. He said the same thing. Unbelievable courage. They pulled the trigger. And it blew much of his face. You could see it when you meet with him. Well, I was so in awe of his courage and his faith, I invited him to a congressional hearing, and you could have heard a pin drop when he testified. He talked about what Boko Haram has done and why the West and the Nigerians themselves and the Africans need to combat it with every ounce of capability that they can deploy. But he also said, we also have to love those who do such hideous things, because that's what Christ would have us do. After going through that terrible trauma, to see a man have that kind of love, even for his enemies, like I said, was awe-inspiring. We now have other problems in Nigeria, again, talking about trends. The Fulani herdsmen are killing and maiming, burning down farms, and in 2018 alone, one estimate puts it at tens of thousands, or thousands, I should say, of Christians in the middle belt of Nigeria who have been killed. We've raised it. I know the administration has raised it, but all of us have to raise it even more, and it's part of what this radicalism, you know, we have no fight with pious Muslims. We have a fight with the jihadists who kill not only Christians but Muslims as well. Let me just conclude with just a little focus, almost conclude, on the issue of the Middle Eastern Christians. We are, and I thank the administration profusely, including the Vice President and Mark Green from USAID, in their efforts to reach out and provide humanitarian assistance, which was not there during the worst times of the ISIS genocide. I remember traveling to Erbil and met with Archbishop Werda. My trip kept getting canceled. I was told not to go to IDP camps, which I went anyway, and learned to my shock and dismay, and I had 10 congressional hearings on it in addition to that, that we were not providing humanitarian assistance to these survivors of the ISIS genocide. And that has changed. And, having heard their stories, every single Christian that I met and every Yazidi that we met as well had lost not one or two, but most of their loved ones. Some were lucky and with their pastors, and others they escaped as a church, but so many of them lost so many of their loved ones. And yet they had a sense of forgiveness and reconciliation, which again was mind-boggling. So again, I want to thank the administration for really stepping up and making sure that these individuals get the care that they so greatly need. And I will conclude on this one. I've been chairman of the China Commission. I've chaired the Human Rights Committee for a number of years. I currently co-chair the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. And over the years have had some 68 hearings on human rights abuses in China. Been there many times, was blocked from going, visa denial for over 7 years, but finally got back in again. And I have to tell you, and I think you know this already, but China is a superpower. Xi Jinping admires the egregious behavior of Mao Zedong. And we have a situation now where China is moving aggressively, as you know, to co-opt, either destroy religion of every kind. They've been trying to destroy the Falun Gong movement, the Tibetan Buddhists, the Muslim Uyghurs, the Christians, the house church movement, to do it. But if they can't destroy it, co-opt it, take it over. And it's called Sinization. It's got a name. It is to make everything they do comport, they being the believers in their communities, comport with Xi Jinping's communist vision. And it is very, very disturbing. We had a woman who testified at one of the hearings, Marco Rubio and I chaired, who told the story from, she was a Uyghur, mother of 3. She lost one of her children in this whole crisis. But they put her into a prison, concentration camp. And she said, we couldn't even lay down. It was so overcrowded. Several of the women died, and others were sick. She was tortured. And she said she prayed to God that he would take her life. She lost all hope. That is what this genocide against the Muslim Uyghurs is all about, perpetrated by Xi Jinping. Who is holding him to account at the United Nations? Maybe a statement here or there that might be made. This is egregious behavior on steroids, and it must stop. Let me also say that when it comes to the Christians, they're rewriting the Bible. The ability of even the officially recognized church, the Three Self movement and the Patriotic Church are now severely compromised. We know of some of the churches, you know all about it as well, that have been compelled to put in surveillance equipment. So Big Brother is watching every single thing that is being done by the faith community. Again, over these next several years, the hope of Xi Jinping is to have all of them just be members of the Communist Party, doing exactly what others would do and co-opting it. Young people can't go to church. So it's a very, very serious problem. So I do call upon our friends, particularly in the Muslim community, those who have benefited from the Belt and Road initiative by Xi Jinping. Some 37 countries recently kind of did a letter, not kind of getting behind Xi Jinping and this whole movement. They should stand firm. The OIC and all the others should say, time out. You're mistreating Muslims in a terrible way, Xi Jinping. You got to stop, and you will not find any, whether it be support and no complicity on the part of the world. So I was disappointed when they wrote that letter, and we've contacted them and asked them, many of the countries, to reverse that. That should not be. They should not live in fear of what Xi Jinping might do economically or any other way. I remember when Liu Xiaobo was named to be the Nobel Peace Prize winner. I was one of the ones who led the effort in the Congress to have him and 2 others, including Chen Guangzhen, so named as Peace Prize winners. I went over for the gathering, and I was frankly shocked at how worried many Europeans were, including the host country, about what they had done and offended the Chinese dictatorship. That's got to end. I mean, Xi Jinping, needs to know. And the gross mistreatment of Liu Xiaobo, who died, as we all know, of cancer, and as of his wife, never got treatment that he so absolutely needed and deserved. We, too, in this country have failed. I'll never forget, and I'll finish on this, when President Obama had President Hu, at a press conference. There he is, a Nobel Peace Prize winner himself, standing side by side with a man who's aggressively oppressing a Nobel Peace Prize winner with torture and the like, incarceration, and wouldn't turn to him and say, "Free him, Mr. President." And when the reporter from the, I believe it was the Associated Press, asked a very good question on human rights, all of a sudden there was problems with the mic, and I mean, it was theater of the absurd. And the Washington Post did a tremendous, I think I'm out of time.
We would love to hear you continue to talk.
Okay. Okay, I'll just finish with this. You know, the Washington Post did an editorial saying, what a missed opportunity to stand up for human rights, and of course, the most important of which is the religious freedom issue. Thank you. Go back to your home countries, those within, and together we will make the difference.
While we have you in the room, thank you again, Representative Smith. We really, really appreciate all your passion, what you've done in this field and space, and we really appreciate you taking time out of a very busy day. I don't think a layperson really, if you're not in Congress or on the Hill, don't realize how important this time is. The number of votes that come, it is just a crazy, crazy period. And for him to be able to come over to the State Department and spend that much time with us, we really, really appreciate it. So thank you. So even though he's not in the room, another round of applause for Frank Smith. For those that don't know me, my name is Kash Kashkai. I'm the Deputy Director in the IRF office, and I'm also the coordinator for this ministerial. And, thank you very much. It is with great pleasure and great honor that I come to speak to you about the end of Track 2 on Day 2. It's been a historic event. We've had over 1,000 people came yesterday. We're going to have the government portion of it occur tomorrow. We'll be pressing governments to make concrete steps and concrete actions to protect religious freedom around the world. And a lot of this, of what we're asking and the engagement we have with the foreign governments is helped. You guys help provide us information, ideas, the energy you give to us that you drive forward in this space is invaluable. So let me say again, on our behalf, thank you very much. We cannot express our appreciation more for your dedication and passion that you present in your day-to-day life, in your own home countries, in the United States and abroad, working on this very, very important issue. Ambassador Brownback, for those it sends his regards as well. Unfortunately, he's at the White House right now and wasn't able to come, so I got the honor to be able to close this particular session. You know, this is not a static space. We're constantly seeking to deepen our understanding. The more we understand, the more we can advocate, so please continue to work with us. Please work with each other. One of the things that we found at last year's ministerial was there's so many people in the same space who didn't know they were working with each other, didn't know they were in the same area, didn't know that a lot of what they were doing could connect with each other, and where one person can do, two people can do more. And then when two can do, communities can do more, you can change the whole world. So Ambassador Brownback has talked about this as the start of a grassroots movement. So we're leaning on you, looking towards you to be able to provide that. So thank you. So now, everybody that has a green underlay of their badge, I'm going to ask you to exit this side of the door. Sean Comer, who you know, if Sean's back there over there saying hi to some folks, will be able to direct you guys to the next event. And then we ask everyone else to extend through the right side. Thank you again. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for your robust participation. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.